Good morning, everyone. That video was a great breath of fresh air. Thank you very much, guys, for putting it together. I hope everyone enjoyed the summer. Most of you had the chance to take a break from your crazy routines. Maybe some people even hopped on a flight and visit some amazing place. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the travel is making its big return. On a personal level, if I may share a little bit of information, I had the chance to take the kids and spend the summer with family in Western France. First time in the air since March 2020. And let me tell you, quite a different experience. The flights were great. Some attendants very pleasant, some others living more in a book than in the reality, but nothing you cannot manage. What surprised me the most was the airport experiences. Such a difference between countries. We left from Montreal, Canada. Few passengers, no line at security, no international lounge open, but we could access the domestic one. We then landed in Frankfurt, Germany, for a short connection. Many more passengers transiting there, as Frankfurt is a European hub. Lines were well organized and signage was okay, so we were able to get around without too much close contact or trouble. Our arrival in Nantes, France was business as usual. No sign of COVID at this airport. Crazy. In our way back, we took a direct flight to Montreal from Paris. The wait line was an easy 2 hours to drop luggage. Even if you checked in online before, you still need an airline attendant to take your luggage. The line for security after that was another 1 hour with no social distancing. All the hand sanitizing stations were empty. Once you make it to your gate with time to kill and figure you'll pass it with some restaurant food, you then realize that all the restaurants, lounges and shops are closed. And I'm talking about Charles de Gaulle Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. I haven't even gotten to the arrival in Montreal. What an experience. Between the ArriveCan app that is checked one at a time by one airport representative, the travelers sneaking their way to the front and the wait again to be granted entry in the country by the border agent. It was a total of 2.5 hours between landing and exiting the airport. I could have used that time to fly to Toronto for dinner and back. All this to say, while hotels and airlines are ready to welcome you, airports are clearly still adjusting. It's worth spending extra time to check rules and regulations prior to the departure. And for the ones of you that will take a plane soon, be prepared to wait at each step of your journey. But enough about that. Back to our webinar. We are all here gathered for that. So thank you very much for attending today. We are very, very proud to see a growing interest into our quarterly event. It has been 1 year since our first edition. Oh my, the context was different. We were then all focused on figuring ways to support the new challenges of our highly valued clients. How to deal with the huge amount of airline cancelled tickets. How to make sure they have access to the latest information on rules and regulations, and how our agents could bring the right level of awareness while not compromising the individual confidence levels of the travelers. We have accomplished a lot during the last year, internally in the way we operate, but also for clients with a new line of products and services, ensuring the highest level of travel support and program management. And here we are today, ready to grow our footprint and our name in North America and beyond. That is right, we're talking global today. To bring a new perspective to this discussion, our very own Fred Gattelli put together an original format for you. We'll have first the pleasure to welcome a special guest, Maurita Baker, who will be with us to share insights and data on recovery of the industry, sustainability efforts, and how Travelport has adapted to the new landscape travel is going through. Maurita is in charge of the Canada and US markets, on top of being our longtime preferred partner at Encore. Fred will then pursue the event by presenting you his most recent findings, touching on vaccinations, Travelers Group, regional recovery, as well as an update on the current toll situation. A last note before we jump into it, this session is recorded and will be shared in our next newsletter. In case you have questions for us or for Maurita, please use the Q&A system by clicking the question mark icon on the top right corner of your screen. We'll take questions after the interview and then after the presentation of Fred and answer them to the best of our abilities in English et en français, bien entendu. We're beyond pleased to have you all here, and without further ado, the floor, or screen I guess, is yours, Fred and Maurita.
Thank you, Elsa. First, I want to thank everybody for attending today. It's always a great pleasure to have someone with us today. We have Maurita Baker with us today, and it's also always a pleasure to really invite everyone who can attend for me to present some of the findings and sort of keep you updated on the industry as a whole. We'll take this hour, really about 50 minutes left, to really go deep into the industry, and I'll be asking a few questions to Maurita and to Maurita Baker, and we'll try to have a constructive discussion on what her thoughts are on the industry, and sort of where she thinks the industry is headed. Now, Maurita, as also mentioned, is the GM for Travelport for Canada and the US. Now, Travelport provides distribution, tech, and payment solutions to the travel and tourism industry, and it's one of the largest global distribution systems. So we should expect a lot of insight from her. No pressure, but we should really have an amazing discussion, and I'm glad to have everybody here today. So Maurita, it's great to meet you. How are you doing?
Wonderful to be here, Fred. I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. I think we'll jump right in. Just to start off, I want to ask, so going back to the past year and a half, we can all assume that the expectations of the traveler have changed since March 2020. Could you maybe discuss sort of the strategy changes you've seen, not only at Travelport, but through talking with with other partners that you have, and sort of what these travel expectations have changed looking like versus currently in 2021 versus those in 2019, and what have been the impacts of those?
Sure. So let me start with just even before the pandemic, we were building out our next generation platform, Travelport Plus, around three things. One, enabling more content so that business travelers can access the right product for their trips. Two, better retail capabilities so that they can easily find that right product. And three, the best value, driving down the costs of travel and the costs to manage those journeys. And so when the pandemic gripped the world and shook the travel industry, our technology and our product teams doubled down their focus to accelerate the development of our next generation platform. Knowing the efficiencies it creates would be even more valuable to our customers and partners coming out of the pandemic, as well as navigating through the pandemic. The pandemic has really accelerated some of the problems that already existed in travel. There's critical demand for solutions that simplify certain processes that create friction for travelers. An example of this is with the huge increase in managing trip change requests and cancellations that the whole industry has faced since the pandemic commenced. So with Travelport Plus, we're providing access to critical automation and exchange tools, which increase efficiencies for agencies processing these ticket exchanges. We're enabling online agencies, travel management companies to provide self-service, sort of kiosk style capabilities for their travelers, which helps offload call centers and avoid that waiting for the next available agent kind of user experience for travelers. So we're implementing all sorts of new technologies to help manage itineraries originating from the diverse sources of content that are available to be shopped and sold, and connecting that content, whether it's hotel, car, air, rail, etc. And whether that's through the kind of legacy industry connections or the much more modern API connections like NDC. So ultimately with the pandemic, our strategy hasn't changed as much as it has accelerated, bringing together the best of Travelport's existing capabilities and tools, and driving the innovation to deliver the unmet needs of our industry. Travelport Plus changes the game in the speed of delivery of modern travel retail and offers a fundamental upgrade to travel technology.
Good. Thank you. So, you know, we talk about that the strategy has not changed as much, you know, from the ideas you had beforehand. What has been sort of the drawback and shortfalls you've encountered that was part of your strategy that you could no longer enact with the arrival of this pandemic?
So sorry, Fred, could you just repeat that? The fallback of what?
So what has been some of the drawbacks,
drawbacks
to implementing this strategy, you know, that has resulted, that has been a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so you know, I think probably the drawback, if you will, from the pandemic is the fact that it's very difficult to predict what recovery will look like exactly, especially as we continue through this period, navigating all the various government restrictions, changing the health guidances, concerns over new variants, the vaccination rates, whether here in Canada or in any of the other countries, and so we definitely have done an enormous amount of work, both internally and in partnership with management consultancy firms, to project recovery, but you can't really project. Therefore, we have to have several different models, and they do change, and we try and be as guided as possible by the data and the business intelligence that we are able to gather from all of the signals around the world to be prepared, whether it's recovering aggressively or more conservatively. And because we're a global company, it is recovery is certainly at a different pace depending on which part of the world in which you are.
I think you're absolutely right. We've seen, you know, there is no precedence to this sort of situation we're in, and so therefore it makes it harder for anyone to really predict what's next. We try to use data points, but it's not as, I guess it becomes harder to still predict. But on that basis, on data and the fact that you talked about these tech solutions that you're sort of enacting. So data is a major component of solutions today. So what has been the role of data and, for example, AI, artificial intelligence use in the past year and a half for Travelport? You know, are there any new major data points or change of thought that has been a result of this? And has that resulted in more challenges regarding data privacy?
Yeah, and there has. And so certainly the pandemic has resulted in the requirement of using data in new and different ways. And so at Travelport, we do use machine learning and AI applications in the cloud to speed up our response times, to optimize how we fulfill search requests and personalize travel content for customers. But as digital practices rapidly increased during the pandemic, especially for travel providers and buyers, the value of data and AI tools to share relevant, accurate information is even more important. An example of this is when agents needed to easily access and share accurate information about the restrictions, health and safety protocols for travelers. You can imagine when the pandemic first broke, but ongoing, just that amount of changing information that was critical to be able to advise travelers. There was no single location that carried up-to-date information from all the variety of sources. So Travelport stepped up and became the first travel technology company to launch a public COVID-19 resource hub. And this ended up being used by hundreds of thousands of travelers and travel agents. With travelers' experience being front and center for Travelport, information needs to be relevant to the user and served in a quick response to queries, and data and AI enable us to continue to improve in these areas. And one of our biggest investments this year involves Travelport's new long collaboration with Amazon Web Services, AWS, and that will elevate our own use of data in the cloud. And when you think about AWS, they power the largest retailer in the world. And we will use AWS's world-class capabilities, such as AI, machine learning, advanced data analytics, to optimize our digital strategy and explore new ways to simplify the way travel is retailed.
Good. So just on that one regarding, you talked about privacy and sort of what you're enacting. There's the idea of trust, the trust that travelers have for the, not only for the travel management companies, but the trust they have, when they're making their bookings. So could you maybe speak a little bit on that trust component and how that's relevant, especially today for the travelers?
Yeah, Fred, we did a survey, a very recent survey with a research company called Edelman, really well known. They're a data and intelligence research company, and we did surveyed 11,000 travelers around the world, 1,000 of them in Canada, and conducted this research around trust specifically. And our findings were that we identified that there are what we call gaps from consumers in travel. And the 4 key ones are price transparency, COVID-19 health and safety measures, data privacy, so that, you mentioned that data privacy is one of those gaps, and information credibility. And from the research was really interesting, because finding that those four areas were where the biggest gaps were for trust, and therefore the biggest need for travelers and for our ability, all of us in the industry, to serve and help travelers. It is around providing the confidence in data privacy. It is around that information credibility, meaning, paid influencers have zero credibility, for example. The health and safety measures and the importance of providing the up-to-date, although it's changing every minute, providing that up-to-date and making that very accessible information, and the pricing transparency. And that's around, and that was number 1, the most critical out of all of them. And the need to have full view and full access to, with no hidden costs in what the cost of a journey is.
Yeah, wow, that's good. So I wanted to maybe bring it a little bit back, and seeing that you look at the data for US and Canada specifically. So we see that, for example, with US domestic travel, we see that it's almost really back to full capacity, and there's been a pickup as well in Canada, with some cross borders expected to open up again soon. So what has been Travelport's response to the quicker recovery in comparison with other parts of the world?
Yeah, so it's in the U.S. domestic market is the largest domestic market in the world. So certainly, as it has been throughout the pandemic, and certainly in the first half of 2021, has really kind of led a lot of the recovery. What's interesting, and there is a slide on the screen, as you can see, in the last month, even a little bit more than a month, the US has started to backslide a little bit. If you see on this slide, what we're showing is, each of the top countries around the globe represented here. The size, of course, of the bubble indicates the size of the market or the travel that takes place. And the colors are, the coral color represents the Americas, black represents Europe, and sand represents Asia Pacific. You can see the US here, compared to 2019, is for domestic, and this is just domestic, not international, but is just not quite at 70. It had been further along, and as I said, has backslided a little bit. And there are some other countries that are doing, from a domestic perspective, better than the US. You can see here, Colombia has exceeded their 2019. Russia and Argentina are very, close to 90. You can see that Asia the recovery is very, very weak. Canada, if you can see, Canada is doing well. It's kind of at around the almost 50% mark, which is really great, because for the longest time, Canada was struggling and was way over on the left side. So we are starting to see more confidence in travelers with the vaccination rate, which has been quite fantastic. And so that's been really good for Canada. But the US, even though it's not, it has backslided a little bit, it represents such a huge portion of overall travel that it's a key driver for certainly what we do at Travelport. We also have here is international. International is a different picture. You can still see that for the most part, all those sand-colored countries are in Asia Pacific have not started, and we know why. We know the border restrictions are not in place to really allow a lot of out-of-country travel. India certainly is the one sort of outlier there, and Pakistan a little bit. But you can see where the US is close to 50%, Canada it's close to 35% in international, which I find very, very encouraging. But it is really interesting, and you see Europe kind of in the middle as well. So it's very interesting to see how different markets are reacting.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it seems that there's which I guess I'll go into later, but it's interesting when you see things like Russia, for example. Russia is very much ahead in terms of the domestic segment, and part of that is that promotion that they have regarding local travel themselves, and sort of easing the travel restrictions internally within the country. So when you look at Russia, for example, it's very interesting to see in this graph, because what it'll show is local promotion of traveling really worked, at least in Russia itself, and to see that huge boost should maybe be an example to what other governments should do in order to really propel and promote their own air travel industry or travel industry overall, right? Hotels, cars, flights, and so forth.
Yep. You're right. Government has such a huge influence on the recovery or not.
Good. Yeah. So I wanted to just talk briefly, about sustainability. So here at Encore, we're big on sustainability, and so are our clients as well. And we try to really get them to reach that carbon emission efficiency, try to get them, in the long term, maybe to that zero carbon goals, net zero carbon goal. Do you see any ways? I'd like to get your opinion on this, but do you see any challenges in the way of the travel industry eventually reaching this net zero carbon emissions in the future, and sort of what has been Travelport's effort in this green space?
Yeah, so I fundamentally believe that to get there, transparency and credibility are crucial for travel management companies and corporate travel managers who need a full and accurate view of available offers from suppliers that are certified as sustainable, including those making an impact to reduce carbon emissions. So our ability to get there is the ability to have access to that information so that decisions can be made when booking travel, so that corporations can align their business trips with their corporate commitments to sustainability. As our industry as a whole continues its path to better travel retailing, we expect technology capabilities to continually improve and play a significant role in ensuring sustainability remains a top priority in corporate travel programs. We're at Travelport, we're exploring this area and have launched a small program in Europe to help agents identify sustainable offers. With this program, travel agencies can easily search and shop travel offers for airlines and hotels that have sustainability certification. We're reliant on having that sustainability certification made available to us so that we can incorporate it into our retailing platform and make it available. until there's improvement in the credibility and transparency into carbon emissions programs adopted by the travel companies that we need to do that and insert them directly into the travel retailing. The travel managers and travel agents can support by becoming as knowledgeable as they can about suppliers and what they're doing. For example, one great resource is IATA's carbon offset program. They have over 30 airlines participating, so it's really great to become involved in that and understand who are those airlines and what are they doing and where they are. Another example is the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO. They've created a carbon emissions calculator that can be used to estimate the carbon footprint for any flight. And so tools like these can help advisors determine and confirm the level of carbon emissions for various routes for their travelers.
That's really interesting, because what we've seen through some research is that what we essentially have is some of the many companies do want to have this, net zero carbon emissions in the future, but not necessarily. But they don't necessarily have a plan on how to achieve that. So a lot of them are looking towards the travel management companies and suppliers to sort of get that rolling for them, because on their end, the only sort of factor that they could control, or they feel, which is not the case, that they feel they could control is the reduction of international flights, or for example choosing alternative methods of travel. Instead of a flight, maybe they take a train, or a car, which will have maybe relatively less carbon emissions per trip. And so it's always a good idea. It's always just interesting to see how the role that travel managers and suppliers and companies such as Travelport could play in really leading this carbon emissions effort, right? And I think you brought up very interesting points in that regard. So I wanted to sort of maybe move the conversation around certain facets. So most times we hear about the conversation being around, are people ready to travel, right? But not so much do we hear on, are the airlines, right, ready for that? So maybe I'd like your opinion on whether you think airlines are ready to acquire these new persons traveling, because what's probably going to happen is we're going to have an influx of travelers coming in all at once. So imagine there are a lot of factors that go into that, for example, pilot retrainings and supply necessary to facilitate that. So have you had any of those conversations with some of these companies on plans they're putting in place to sort of get ready for that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so I think our insight around readiness are really the airlines and from a supply perspective. And you're right, now in order to have that supply and have the capacity. So a lot of our business intelligence, where we look at insights for what people are shopping for, it tells us, and we therefore can tell other suppliers and airlines where people are wanting to travel and what the sort of demand is, so that airlines can have, it's about having the right capacity. In order to have the right capacity, some of the things you're talking about is how do they deal with readiness, having airlines that are ready to fly, having crews that are ready to and equipped to take those flights, retraining. There's also a big talent shortage right now, as we've all seen in any kind of a service industry as well, and the travel industry is not immune to that. There is a talent gap right now, with a lot of people having had to exit the industry. So that's also a challenge. The airlines are doing an enormous amount of work to absolutely be prepared, to have the capacity in the air, to be able to handle the capacity as it comes. There's been some lessons learned where there was higher demand than there was available supply, and that did cause friction for travelers and has. But everything from the health and safety, and certainly the HEPA filters and the air filtration, and the training and the retraining and getting those planes back in the air, I think the airlines are doing a very good job.
Good. And one thing I'm curious about is usually this trend. or sort of if you see a trend, a lot of times you expect to see this trend regarding travel managers' negotiation of preferred rates, for example. Do you think that individual companies currently have the leverage to sort of get these preferred rates that they want, especially given that many of them are well below their 2019 numbers? And do you find that some of these suppliers in turn have adjusted to their expectations of what counts as leverage and what their expectations are? And how has that sort of shifted in the current environment?
Yeah, and so I have found, generally speaking, not being an expert on what every airline is doing with different corporations, but I have found an incredible amount of what I would call partnership, this desire to make sure that coming out of recovery, out of the pandemic or during recovery, that there's value for everybody, for the airlines, for the corporations, and the only way to really do that is to look at 2019 behaviors, volumes, and use that as a benchmark versus the lack of travel that has generally occurred over the last year and a half.
Okay, so we should expect that adjustment that has been made just in comparison to 2019.
Yes, however, not speaking from an airline, when you're negotiating with your next carrier, you won't say, Maurita said you'd do this, but for the most part, that's generally what I'm seeing.
Okay. And so most of our attendees today are within this North American context, and you as well sort of know this American context. So regarding sort of your leadership position in Travelport, could you maybe contrast a couple points in the biggest management differences you see between US and Canada? Are the interactions different between your American clients versus the Canadian ones, and sort of where are those differences?
Yeah, interesting. It's been said that there are no differences between Americans and Canadians, and the only way to tell the two apart is to tell that to a Canadian. So that's a bit tongue in cheek. And so I am a Canadian living and working in the US. And I do find that statement, which, was whoever said it initially, it was a joke, but it kind of encapsulates the spirit of the dynamics of the two countries. The US, as we all know, is a huge market, the largest commerce, largest population, and Canada is adjacent to the US. And so the US, I find businesses have I am the biggest, businesses and individuals, I am the biggest, and have a mindset as being the biggest. That's where they kind of, everything's driven from that. Whereas Canada, next to the US, is I am competing with the biggest. And so that just creates kind of a little bit of a dynamic. What I find managing businesses in both countries is that, and I think anybody, and I'm sure a lot of people here on this webinar operate in both countries and have business all over the world, but there's always this competition for resource as well and priorities. And so that is a bit of a dynamic. I find that Canadians want to make sure that when they're engaging with any stakeholder, a partner, a supplier, anybody at all, that there isn't an assumption that what works for the US will work for Canada. And I think that requires everybody to sort of understand and have understand the culture of Canada and the fact that it is not the US. While there are similarities, and we can absolutely leverage those similarities, and we certainly do at Travelport by creating one North American region, we get to really leverage the scale of the US to support Canada, but understanding the differences between the two. And ultimately, though, I would say that US, Canada, and the whole world for that matter, fundamentally, the kind of golden rule is what needs to lead, and that's treating everybody with respect and treating everybody as you'd want to be treated, regardless of location.
Great, thank you for that. I think we're nearing just close to time, but I just, we like to ask this always at the end when we have guests, but our clients are obviously very interested in sort of the pricing of where flights and cars and hotels are headed. Do you have an opinion on that? Should people be booking their flights today versus in 2 months' time? What is your insight on that?
And it's the old adage, supply and demand, right, is going to drive that. And so there's been different philosophies, and those have been over the past few months, and those have been driven by the fact that the demand for travel has gone up and down a little bit. So hard to say, because I'm not in revenue management for an airline. So what I won't speak as an expert, but I will say that my experience has, because I have traveled a fair bit and arranged travel for my family and whatnot to go back and forth over the border, is that I've seen a huge variance in pricing depending on the time that when I made that booking. And so there has been certain indicators that fares are going to go up and have already started to go up quite a bit. So a few months ago, fares were quite low, but we're starting to see for the fall that the rates are going up with the demand. I just go back to just finish it with supply and demand. If demand starts to drop a bit, rates also start to go down, and capacity, whether or not there's the capacity, also plays a fair, incredible factor in the pricing as well.
Okay, so we should see that sort of linear rise, that demand goes up, prices are most likely to go up as airlines readjust to sort of the new influx of travelers coming in.
Correct.
Good. Thank you so much, Maurita. I think we can take some questions from the audience if there are any. Elsa?
I don't have any at the time. That would be for Maurita or for yourself, right? So now is the time. If ever one of you have like any questions or would like to know more about one particular subject that we spoke about, I'll just would like to reflect on some of the highlights that I noted over the discussion. So I was very interested to see the contrast between the recovery in domestic travel versus international travel, and it's, I would say, funny, but it's not funny, but comforting in a way that to see at the start of the pandemic, it was already expected that the domestic market will drive the recovery, and then rules and regulations of different governments will lead the recovery of the international travel. And this is exactly what we saw on your graph, Maurita. Now that we are in this recovery phase, to see that this expectation or this forecast actually make it up. While I was starting this feedback, we received a question that is, how do you convince travelers to book a more sustainable flight, hotel, or car, which may traditionally not be their preferred initial choice? Have you seen, Maurita, any kind of data, or Fred maybe, about the value that has a sustainable choice versus more traditional one in the, let's say, the buying process?
Yeah, and so I think the question could be asked even not about a sustainable flight, but how do you convince a traveler to take a flight that's on an airline that is part of the corporate program versus another airline, but the traveler's preference is to fly X airline and the corporate program is Y. So it's a combination of what's important to the corporation that traveler is working for and representing, and helping to make that be part of the culture of the corporation, so that travelers understand that that's an important key value for the corporation, and therefore that's what's going to be preferred over another supplier who doesn't provide the same level of sustainability. So I think that combined with providing them the information so that they can also understand the differences between the impact of one supplier versus another and their sustainability efforts.
So just to wrap up in French, because we made a commitment to our French audience to be able to answer them in their language as well. Donc, je vais récapituler un petit peu la réponse de Maurita sur la question qui est la meilleure façon de faire en sorte qu'un voyageur va davantage pencher pour un billet d'avion ou un hôtel qui a un programme plus écologique ou de préservation de l'environnement et des communautés. Donc, la réponse de Maurita tenait en deux parties. La première, c'est vraiment que ce changement-là, on parle de voyage corporatif exclusivement, ce changement-là vient de prime abord de la part de la compagnie en tant que telle. S'il y a une politique, s'il y a une influence de la part de la corporation en tant que telle ou de la gouvernance, de la compagnie du voyageur, le choix va se faire plus facilement puisque les compagnies aériennes ou les chaînes d'hôtels qui sont davantage engagées dans ce genre de programme-là vont être mis de l'avant et vont être encouragés à être utilisés par les voyageurs de la compagnie. Et d'un second temps, c'est vraiment en ce qui a trait de l'information. Comment est-ce que les programmes de préservation de l'environnement et des communautés sont communiqués par les lignes aériennes, par les chaînes d'hôtels aux voyageurs? Est-ce que c'est avec les agents où il y a besoin d'une bonne formation de leur part? Est-ce que ce sont sur les outils de réservation en ligne où il y a besoin peut-être aussi là d'une petite mise à jour sur les moyens de communiquer ce genre de détails? That was a quite long translation.
I liked
it. So I hope we answer the question of our audience. You still have a couple of minutes if there is any other portion or subjects that you would like to go deeper in details. I just wanted to touch base also on the sustainability part that Fred and you, Maurita, have been discussing. And just to add that sustainability is expensive. So if we talk about having an airline to put together a sustainability program, it needs to be funded. So that goes like hand in hand really with the recovery from that perspective of how do we go forward with a more sustainable way of traveling. So that was a very interesting subject, and actually one that was one of the most popular, I would say, in the corporate travel world before the pandemic hit. And I'm very happy to see, because that's close to my heart, very happy to see that subject and this kind of reflections and solutions to be put in place now that we are recovering towards a more global travel perspective. So I take it there is no further question. Thank you very much, Maurita, for having spent this morning with us. And we'll let Fred continue with the second part of our event.
Thank you, Maurita.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Okay, so just in the interest of time, I think I'll just move through some things here, and I always like to do a little recap of sort of the different types of travelers that we'll have, and you can judge for yourself where you stand in that role as a traveler or as a company. And then from there, we could sort of get an idea of what your path would be, or what we think your path would be, right? So when we break down corporate trips into these segments, it can help us sort of get an idea of who the travel partners are, the suppliers are, and as well create that plan for the return back to travel. So there are about 4 different groups here. I just want to mention quickly into the sort of travelers you'll see today. And if you're into one of these groups, then you can better align with what your expectations should be. Now, different companies will have a mix of these travelers throughout. So it's not a one size fits all, but it tends to be that they're all pretty much intermingled. So one, you'll have the ongoing travelers. So this ongoing traveler really never stopped traveling, right? They got right back on the road as travel restrictions were eased. So these persons can be primarily for those who are in the oil industry, manufacturing, where, for example, on-site visits are mandatory, and where they deal with factories and they have to always be aligned with their processes. So these people, are the new road warriors if they weren't before, right? Always on the road. As soon as travel opened up, they'll be there. Second, you'll have the forever lost segment. This is the complete opposite of the ongoing traveler. So these are people who are basically victims of these travel budget cuts that have been going on. Now, we talked about, for example, a lot of these companies finding cost saving measures throughout the pandemic, and with a lot of C-suite executives really being very involved in these travel strategy in the past year, you're going to get a big group of these persons just not being there anymore. So these are people who are able to maintain high effectiveness working from home or conducting business remotely. Now, speaking on the previous segment of ongoing travelers, advances have been made in digital technologies as well that would further maybe reduce these direct interactions. So we have seen this in action, for example, in the restaurant industry, where there are virtual assessments now that take place that no longer require management to be on site. So older portion of these forever lost business trips will continue after the pandemic. Even in this segment, they will be at lower levels. Then we'll have the competitive industry travelers, right? I think most of our attendees today fit into this group. They are the majority or the bulk of the business travelers, over 60% usually in this group. So these are the people who will drive the rebound of corporate travel, right? And I say competitive industry because these are the people who will be traveling to cultivate these relationships with their clients. Now, we expect smaller, just due to company politics, a lot of times these smaller and medium-sized businesses will be the first on the road just because they require less approval and less, I would say, quote-unquote bureaucracy. But what they will essentially create is this domino effect where if one company's if one company resumes their business trips, it will create a catalyst for all their competitors and rivals to immediately go right into that as well and enact their business travel, work-related travel. So these, again, people faced with intense competition, and will be right on the road, just dependent on everybody, on what everyone else around the industry is doing. Now, what these companies usually will have is the fear that, if they come out of this pandemic, they might come out of it with a lot less market power and largely depreciated client rapport, especially if at the worst case they've lost them to their competitors, right? And so this is really the third group and the majority group. And the last group are the non-competitive segments. So these are travelers who work in non-competitive roles or industries. So this means those in the public sector, for example, right? So these are the travelers or companies who are able to host or hold virtual events that can replace in-person conferences, for example. And these are the persons who have no rush to get back on the road and are more cautious on the return to travel. And in this group, apart from public sector, you have a lot of professional associations as well and NGOs involved in this. So when you take this together, what we see is that what you'll have in through this chart at the bottom is the priority of what's likely to take place, which is sales meetings that are regional are probably going to take priority over sales meetings that are domestic and international. So the further you go out over time, you should expect just less and less likely that that they will be going back to recovery. Then you have internal meetings again. Internal meetings are the second thing to come after sales meetings. Again, regional up to international, regional being most likely to recover quicker, and then slowest will be international. Same with conferences, which follow the same trajectory. Now I'll go into quickly the sort of a timeline built on expectations of return to travel. And so this is a chart from Deloitte just showing on a survey on when the state of companies expecting to reach a percentage of the 2019 spend by quarter. Now this all goes all the way forward to 2022 Q4, so end of next year. And so what you'll see is by Q4 2022 is that, you know, many companies, right, 54%, let's say 34% and 54%, which is about 9 in 10 companies expect to have reached over 75% of their spend levels of 2019. So this gives us an idea again of what the recovery path looks like. Now, if we went by quarter, we could say that, you know, if we're looking at Q2, Q3 of this year, which we're currently in, companies will have begun to loosen the travel restrictions, you know, no longer only allowing, for example, essential travel. You'll have a lot of domestic travel, which has become safer and easier as states and provinces lift some of these quarantines on arrival recommendations. You'll have companies that require, you still have companies that still require extra layers of approval for some of these corporate trips, but which will be slowly eased as time goes by. Now, if you go by Q4 of 2021, what you'll see is that there'll be an acceleration of return to offices. Now, you know, talking with whether it be friends or colleagues, we've seen that a lot of companies are moving up their timelines to by Q4 to get some people, at least let's say up to 50% of their people back in the offices, and sort of having that hybrid work from home and office policies in place. So during this period, as people go back to the office, this will trigger travel as well, right? So you'll get a lot of people who, you know, are leading that sort of double travel depending on their convenience. So around this period, conferences will still sort of be in this hybrid format. We definitely don't expect conferences to all of a sudden just pop up, but what we do expect is that possibility and option for this hybrid format of conference where some persons can attend these large conferences, whereas others attend them virtually. Now, when we talk about international travel, barriers will start reducing around Q4 2021 for sure. These quarantine measures that are currently in place for Europe, Americas, and the Middle East, for example, will ease. But I would say that even by Q4 2021, we should expect that most travel will still remain domestic. So this is where sort of you saw that chart that Maurita pulled up that, you know, you expect sort of that, you expect that increase in travel coming up towards the end of the year, but still most of it will be concentrated on domestic and regional travel rather than international. Now, as we get into Q1 and Q2 of 2022, you're supposed to get this sort of mix of you know, this is flu season in the winter, so a lot of concern will come up around this area. Is the expectation where if the pandemics and vaccinations are not high enough, some of this worry will start to come back around, but still we should still expect an improvement in the performance of travel and these companies sort of getting their employees out there. And at this point, really, you will have some of the resistance that will likely reach the peak around the winter, around the 2021-2022, so February, March, maybe, as again I mentioned with this flu, but it will still be on the up and up as more companies ramp up their travel, and as competition will surely just keep rising, regardless of what the season is like. Now, obviously, as it gets to around the spring, more confidence, more competition, ramp up of travel as well for this portion. So this is where we see a lot of these, a bigger share of some of this spending increasing over time. Now, when we get to the last half of next year, what should we expect, right? At this point, a lot of these Europe North America should have had high vaccination rates at this point, with, barring any huge, variants of the virus that might obviously create some sort of setback. But other than that, we should really expect the travel to be all the way up. International travel will have continued to improve, bringing this connectivity to people around the world. Now, there's a caveat to that. Maurita had mentioned it slowly, and as you saw in the chart, Asia will still be sort of an expectation that Asia will still be a little bit behind, just so that we've seen, for example, with the Chinese government, they've pulled back on their travel, on their travel measures, sort of creating more restrictions around their borders. We've seen India not doing too well with COVID-19, as they're currently only really now ramping up their vaccination effort. We've seen Japan as well. With the Olympics, I'm pretty sure they will be more hesitant to get people back out and traveling, just as a lesson they've learned out of this. So I see I'm pressed for time. So just all this to say that the sort of travel we expect to see is coming. The expectation of return is high. Travel providers and employees and companies will adapt to this new reality of currently fewer overall trips, which will ramp up in the next year or two. There will be a greater need to integrate this face-to-face with virtual in a hybrid format. And as well as there will need to be a greater emphasis on the relationship building nature of corporate travel. So while this recovery of corporate travel is, more than a year away, it's very positive. Our research shows that it's very positive. Again, we don't have precedence, data for this, but based on the sort of predictions that have been out there so far, they've been on par generally on the sort of trend that we should be able to see in the coming few years. So again, this is a great time for everyone to strengthen up the relationship and demonstrate that there is an ability to excel in business travel as it becomes more transformed and as becomes more easier to navigate for the average traveler. I think that's it. I don't want to speak anymore. I could talk on this for an hour more, but I'll stop it here. I don't know if there are any other questions also that have come up during this time.
Nothing new, Fred. We just had good comments of hello, very interesting, thank you. So thank you very much for these cute notes. So I have a couple of minutes to spend with you. If ever anyone would like to ask anything else to Fred, it's a shame because he did a great work with the presentation and the slides. But I guess the conversation with Maurita was so interesting. We couldn't cover every subject. So just for you to know, the recording will be available in the next newsletter, and maybe we can do like sort of a summary, maybe by writing, Fred, to share your slides and your insights of your analysis and research.
Absolutely, we'll share all that information I had lined up. We'll share our conversation with Maurita, of course. And so please bring any questions even after the fact. We welcome them and more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Fred. On this good note, I will wish everyone a great Tuesday, last day of the month, last day of the last month of the summer. It's already back to school for quite a lot of people. So good luck with that. It's not that easy for everyone. And thank you again for spending the last hour with us. It was a pleasure to welcome you.
Thanks, Elsa.
Thank you, Maurita.